My parents cut me off financially because I would not raise their newborn child after they decided they were too old to do it. My parents had a baby when I was already grown, then they decided they were too old to do the hard parts, and when I said I was not raising their newborn for them, they cut me off financially like they were canceling a subscription. I am Sable, I am 24, I am in the last stretch of a credential program that has been swallowing my life, and I have been getting a mix of help from my parents that I used to think was support, but now I see it was leverage. They covered part of my tuition and kept me on their phone plan and car insurance, and I paid my rent and groceries and everything else. It was not like I was living off them completely, but it was enough that them yanking it would hurt. My parents are Maris and Dorian. They are both in their late 50s. They have always acted younger than their age, like they took pride in being the fun couple who takes weekend classes and redecorates the living room every time they get bored, and I will admit, for years I felt weirdly proud of them for that, because a lot of my friends had parents who seemed checked out. Mine were always doing something. I was an only child, which matters, because I grew up being the whole emotional spotlight. When they were happy, I was their little miracle. When they were stressed, I was their worry project. When they needed a purpose, I was the purpose, and I thought that was normal until I left home and realized other people's parents did not monitor their moods the way I had to. About a year ago, Maris started making strange little comments about second chances, about how she felt like she rushed motherhood the first time, about how she wished she could do it again now that she had patience, and I remember laughing awkwardly and saying, "You can babysit someone else's kid and get your fix," and she gave me this small smile like I did not understand what she was really saying. Then they announced they were expecting, and I thought they were joking at first, because it sounded like a prank, like something they would do to get reactions, but no, it was real, and they were glowing in that way people glow when they feel like the main characters again. Dorian kept calling it their surprise blessing. Maris kept talking about how modern medicine makes anything possible now, and I kept trying to be supportive while also internally screaming, because this was not a puppy, this was a whole human being, and I could not figure out why nobody in their life was reacting the way I was. Everyone just kept saying, "Wow, you two are so brave." I did not love the whole thing, but I told myself it was their choice, and that I could be the adult daughter who shows up, brings diapers, smiles for pictures, then goes back to my own life. The first time I felt that ice-cold dread was when Maris started asking me about my schedule, not in a normal curious way, but in a detailed way, like she wanted to map my time. She asked how many days a week I was in lab, how many hours I worked, whether my evenings were flexible, whether my program had breaks, and I answered like a fool because she was my mom and I thought she was just being chatty. Then she started saying things like, "You have always been so good with babies, and you are so calm, and you always know what to do," and I would laugh and say, "I do not even have a baby, what are you talking about?" And she would just smile like she was planting seeds. Their baby, a little boy they named Kellen, was born about 2 months ago, and the first couple weeks were exactly what you would expect. They were exhausted, they were overwhelmed, they were messaging me photos constantly, and I did the normal daughter thing. I visited after work, I brought supplies, I held him for short stretches so Maris could shower, and Dorian would hover like he wanted to supervise even the way I held a swaddled newborn. I started noticing something, though. The way they talked about caring for him sounded like they were describing a group project they did not want to do alone. Maris would say she had not slept in 2 nights and she did not know how people do this, and Dorian would say his back could not take rocking for hours, and they were both so dramatic about being tired that it felt like they were trying to build a case, like they were preparing me to feel sorry enough to volunteer. Then one evening, about 3 weeks after Kellen was born, Maris asked if I could come over because they wanted to talk, and she said it in that tone that means, "You are going to be responsible for my feelings in about 10 minutes. Their house was quiet in a way that made me tense, like they had staged it. Kellen was asleep in a bassinet in the living room, and Maris had set out tea like we were at a meeting. Dorian sat in his usual spot, hands folded, looking serious. Maris started with compliments, which is how she always starts when she is about to ask for something huge. She told me she was proud of me, she told me I was doing so well, she told me I was responsible. Then she said she and Dorian had been talking and they realized they needed help, real help, not just a visit here and there. She said they were too old for the newborn phase, she said she underestimated how hard it would be, she said their bodies were not bouncing back, and she said something that made my stomach clench. She said, "You are young, you can do this." Dorian jumped in and started framing it like a plan, not a question. He said they wanted me to take Kellen during the week, just for a while, so they could sleep and recover, and he said they could take him on weekends, and he said it like that was a normal arrangement, like you just trade a baby back and forth like a library book. I remember staring at them both and feeling this intense disbelief, because it was so out of line I could not even find the right emotion. It was like being asked to donate a kidney because someone did not like dialysis. I asked what they meant by take him, like, physically take him to my apartment, and Maris nodded immediately like she was relieved I understood. She said yes, he could stay with you, and you can bring him to your classes if you need to, and she said it like she was suggesting I bring a water bottle to class. I told her my program is not baby-friendly, my job is not baby-friendly, my apartment is not set up for a newborn, and also, I am not his parent, and Maris's face tightened, and she switched into injured mode so fast it gave me whiplash. She said she was not asking me to be his parent, she was asking me to be family, she said she raised me and sacrificed for me, and she said this was my chance to give back, and Dorian nodded along like he was validating the contract they made up in their heads. I tried to keep calm, because I knew if I got emotional they would use it. I told them I could help with specific things, I could come by for short stretches, I could run errands, I could bring supplies, but I was not taking their newborn to raise for them, not for weekdays, not for months, not for any version of this. Maris started crying, not quiet tears, big dramatic sobs, and she held her hand over her chest like I had attacked her, and Dorian leaned forward and told me I was being selfish. He told me I had no idea how hard it is at their age, he told me I would understand when I had kids, and I told him I might not have kids, and his face twisted like I had said something offensive. Then Maris said the line that made everything snap into clarity. She said, "We did this for our family, and now you are abandoning us." And I realized this was not about need, it was about entitlement. They had created a baby as a family project and assumed I would be drafted. I left that night feeling shaky, and on the drive home my hands kept slipping on the steering wheel because they were sweaty. I got home and sat on my couch and stared at my blank wall for a long time, trying to picture what my life would look like if I said yes, and all I saw was my program falling apart, my job falling apart, my mental health collapsing, and me becoming the primary caregiver for a child I did not choose. The next day Maris called like nothing happened. She asked if I could come pick Kellen up after my classes, and I told her no, and she went cold, like her crying was a costume she took off. She said fine, she said do not worry about it, and she hung up. 2 days later my phone stopped working, not like the battery died, like my number was no longer active. I went to the carrier store inside a big indoor market hall where they have little stalls for services, and the employee pulled up my account and told me the line was cancelled by the primary account holder, and my stomach dropped because I knew exactly who did that. I asked if I could reactivate it in my name, and he said yes, but I needed a new plan and a new payment method, and I stood there with people milling around behind me and I wanted to cry, not because of the phone, but because it was so clear now that they were punishing me. That same day my car insurance app sent me a notification that my coverage was cancelled, not changed, not updated, cancelled, and I felt this rush of panic because I commute across town and I cannot risk driving uninsured. I pulled into a small side street, parked, and called the insurer, and they told me the policy holder requested the vehicle be removed and the policy closed, and yes, it was Maris. I had to buy a new policy that afternoon on my own, and it cost more than I expected because my previous discounts were tied to their bundle, and I sat in my car staring at the confirmation screen feeling like the floor was dropping out under me in slow motion. Then a tuition piece hit, because the next week my program portal showed a balance due, and it was the chunk my parents had promised to cover, and it was marked urgent, and my chest tightened so hard I felt nauseous, because I cannot just snap my fingers and produce that amount of money. I called Maris, from a borrowed phone number because mine was still being set up, and she did not answer. I tried Dorian, he answered and sounded annoyed, and I asked what was going on with tuition, and he told me they would not be paying another cent until I started acting like family. I asked him if this was about Kellen, and he said yes, and he said if I could not step up, then I could step out, and he told me they were done financing my life. I started shaking so hard I had to sit down on my kitchen floor, because it was like being grounded by your parents when you are an adult, except the grounding is losing essential services, and I felt this mix of rage and humiliation that made my throat burn. I did not have time to collapse, though, because a tuition deadline was real, so I went to my program office the next day, not a therapist office, not anything like that, just the administrative wing of our technical college, and I asked to talk to someone about emergency payment options. I met with a financial aid coordinator named Halima, and Halima listened without making me feel dramatic. She asked what changed. I told her my parents withdrew support suddenly, and she asked if there was a safety issue at home, and I told her not physical, just coercive, and Halima nodded like she understood exactly the category. She told me there were emergency grants for students facing sudden loss of support, but I would need documentation, and she said documentation could be as simple as a screenshot of the portal balance, proof of past payments, and proof the payment source changed, like a letter from my parents, which I obviously did not have. Halima suggested a different form of proof. She said if my phone plan and insurance were cancelled, those cancellation notices could help show a pattern, and my stomach twisted because it meant I had to gather evidence against my own parents like this was a case file. I went home that night and printed the cancellation notifications and a tuition portal balance, and I wrote a short statement explaining the timeline, and I felt nauseous the whole time. Meanwhile, my parents kept escalating in small ways. Maris left a voicemail on my new number, and she sounded calm again, like she was offering peace. She told me she had a bassinet picked out for my place, she told me Dorian could drop it off, and she told me they could give me an allowance for diapers if I took Kellen during the week, and hearing her talk like this was a normal negotiation made my skin crawl. I did not respond, because I knew any response would become an opening for her to argue, and instead I focused on keeping my life afloat. I picked up extra shifts at work, I asked my supervisor for more hours temporarily, and my supervisor, a union guy named Pax who normally stays out of personal drama, quietly asked if I needed help connecting to our employee hardship program, and that was the first time in this whole mess I felt like someone saw me as a person instead of a role. I told Pax the basics, that my parents were trying to force me to take custody of their newborn and they cut off support when I said no, and Pax did not gasp or judge, he just said, okay, then we protect your schedule and keep your checks steady, and he helped me adjust my shift bids so I could work more without crashing my program attendance. Then came the moment that turned this from financial pressure into something that felt like a trap. One evening I got a call from a pediatric clinic I recognized as my parents' clinic. The receptionist asked if I was Sable, then asked if I was Kellen's emergency contact, and I felt my stomach drop, because I never agreed to that. I told her I was his sister, not his guardian, and she sounded confused. She said the parents listed me as the primary pickup person if they could not be reached, and she asked if that was accurate, and I told her no, it was not, and I asked her not to list me, and she said she would note the file, but she also sounded like she had a script she had to follow. She asked if I wanted to speak to the clinic manager because they take custody arrangements seriously. I said yes, and the manager got on and asked me to clarify whether there was any legal guardianship document naming me, and I said absolutely not, and she asked if I would be willing to put that in writing for their records, and I told her I would come in and sign whatever I needed to sign as long as it was only about removing my name. I went in the next day, and the clinic had me sign a form stating I do not have permission to pick up the child and I should not be contacted as a guardian, and I felt like I was signing a document that should not exist, because this is my parents, this is supposed to be simple, but it was not. When I got back to my car, I saw a message from Halima saying my emergency grant was approved pending final review, and I almost cried right there in the clinic lot, because it meant I might not lose my program over my parents' tantrum. That same afternoon, Dorian showed up at my program building, not at my apartment, not at my door, but at the campus, which made me feel trapped because I cannot control who sees what when someone shows up where you are trying to appear normal. I was leaving a lab session, and I saw him by the entrance with the stroller, like he was making a statement, and people were walking past and smiling at the baby, and Dorian's face was set like stone. He walked toward me and started talking like we were having a normal family discussion. He told me Maris was exhausted, he told me they needed a break, he told me they were ready to forgive my attitude, and he said they brought Kellen so I could take him for the afternoon and prove I can do it. I felt heat rise up my neck so fast I thought I might faint, because this was not a request, this was him trying to transfer a baby to me in public where I would feel pressured to comply. I told him no, quietly, and he leaned closer and told me not to embarrass him, and I told him he was embarrassing himself by doing this, and a campus security officer who was standing near the front desk looked over, not because of volume, but because of the tension, and I saw Dorian notice the officer, and he adjusted his tone instantly, like he wanted to look reasonable in case someone watched. I told Dorian that if he tried to leave Kellen with me, I would contact child welfare, and Dorian's eyes flashed with anger. Then he did that controlled calm thing and told me I would regret threatening my own family. He tried to push the stroller handle toward me like you hand someone a cart, and I stepped back, and I told him again, no, and the security officer came over and asked if everything was okay, and Dorian tried to smile and say it was a family misunderstanding, and the officer asked me directly if I wanted Dorian to leave, and my throat tightened because I did not want to be that person creating a scene, but I also did not want my father learning that he could corner me and win. So I said yes, I want him to leave. The officer told Dorian he needed to step off campus property if he was not a student or scheduled visitor, and Dorian's face hardened, but he backed down because there were now eyes, and he walked out pushing the stroller so fast he almost bumped into a display stand. I stood there shaking, and my classmates were pretending not to stare, and I wanted to disappear, but I also felt this grim certainty settle in. My parents were not going to stop until someone with authority forced them to stop. That night Maris called and left another voicemail. She sounded furious but controlled. She said I humiliated Dorian. She said I am turning strangers against them. She said if I do not come get Kellen and do the right thing, they will make sure I lose my program. She said they know people, and she said it with that smug little laugh that made my skin crawl. I went to sleep for maybe 2 hours, woke up with my heart racing, and I realized something that made me feel cold all the way through. They were not just trying to guilt me, they were trying to corner me financially and socially until taking the baby felt like the only option. So that is where I am. My parents cut me off financially because I would not raise their newborn. They tried to drop the baby on me at my campus. They listed me as emergency contact without consent, and they are still acting like this is a reasonable family plan and I am the selfish one for refusing. Update 2 weeks later. The last 2 weeks have been a weird mix of paperwork and panic, like my life turned into forms and phone calls, and every time I think I have stabilized one piece, my parents poke at another edge to see if it will tear. The emergency grant came through, which saved my enrollment, but it was not free money raining from the sky, it was a one-time bridge, and I still had to rearrange everything else. Halima helped me file for a different payment plan for the remaining balance, and I took on extra hours at work, and Pax helped me move to a shift pattern that let me keep attending labs, which meant I was basically awake all the time. The first escalation after the campus incident was my parents going public in their own circles, not on social media, not in some viral way, but in that more poisonous small-town network way where one person at a community center tells another person, and suddenly your name is being discussed by people you have not seen in years. I found out because a volunteer coordinator I used to help once a month at a museum archive workshop, not a coffee shop or anything like that, messaged me through the volunteer portal asking if I was okay. She said Maris had been telling people I was having a breakdown and needed family support, and she asked if I wanted them to pause my volunteer access until things calmed down, like she was trying to protect me but also trying to avoid drama. I felt my face burn reading that, because Maris was already laying the groundwork to make me look unstable, which would make it easier for her to claim I could not be trusted, and also to guilt me, because who wants to be the daughter rumored to be falling apart? I asked the coordinator what exactly Maris said, and she told me Maris claimed I was refusing to help with the baby because my schooling made me overwhelmed, and she implied I was not coping well, and she kept repeating that I needed to come home, and that phrase come home made my stomach twist, because I am not a teenager, I live on my own, but Maris still talks like she owns my default location. I went to Halima again because I did not know who else to ask, and Halima told me something simple that helped. She said when people start creating a story about you, the safest thing you can do is have your own clean record, and she offered to connect me with the college's student advocacy officer, not therapy, not counseling, just an advocate who helps with administrative safety plans when family pressure interferes with school. I met with the advocacy officer in a plain conference room in the student services wing, and I explained the campus stroller incident, the financial cutoff, and the clinic emergency contact issue, and the officer asked if I feared my parents would attempt to remove me from school or impersonate me, and I said I did not know, but I would not put it past them, and the officer helped me set a password on my student records so changes could not be made without an extra verification step. That same day I also went to the pediatric clinic again, because I did not trust that my removal form would hold if my parents pressured the staff, and the clinic manager assured me the note was in the file, and she also told me something that made my skin go cold. She said Maris had called after my visit asking why they were questioning her parenting choices, and the clinic manager told her they were not. They were simply correcting an emergency contact error, and Maris apparently became angry, and asked if the clinic was going to report her. The manager said Maris's reaction raised concerns, and she documented the call, and she told me if Maris continued trying to assign custody to me without consent, she would have to consider a mandated report because it can signal neglect planning, and hearing that made my stomach twist, because I do not want my baby brother pulled into an investigation, but I also do not want him used as a bargaining chip. Then my parents tried a different tactic. They did not show up at my apartment, they did not show up at my campus again, instead they tried to get me to show up somewhere they controlled. Dorian left a message through my aunt, the only relative I still speak to consistently, saying there was a family meeting scheduled at their neighborhood association hall, like it was a board meeting, and he wanted me there to discuss a solution, and my aunt, who is usually neutral, sounded stressed. She told me she thought I should go because Maris was crying constantly and Dorian was getting angry, and she said she was worried about the baby. I told my aunt I would not attend anything that was framed as me taking over parenting, but I did agree to meet in a public administrative setting where there would be a neutral professional present, because I needed this to stop being emotional theater. The weirdest part is the neutral professional ended up being someone from a family support nonprofit that partners with the pediatric clinic, a coordinator named Noemi, who runs parenting resource sessions and explains options like home health aides, respite care, and community support, and Noemi agreed to facilitate a sit-down meeting in a small library meeting room attached to the clinic, not a therapist office, just a community room with a table and some pamphlets on a shelf. I thought, okay, this could be real. This could be them realizing they need help and asking for actual resources instead of trying to hand me their newborn. Maris and Dorian arrived with Kellen. Maris looked exhausted, but also weirdly polished, like she did her hair to look composed. Dorian looked stiff, like he was going to treat this like a negotiation, and Noemi greeted them warmly, then looked at me and asked me to explain what I was willing to do. I said I was willing to be an involved sister, visits when I can, occasional errands, support in finding resources, but I was not willing to take custody, I was not willing to become weekday caregiver, and I was not willing to be listed as emergency contact or pickup person without my consent. Maris's face tightened, and she started crying again, and Noemi gently redirected, asking Maris to describe what support she needed, and Maris said she needed sleep, she needed her body back, she needed time to feel like herself again, and Noemi started offering options, respite programs, visiting nurse check-ins, parent support volunteers, and a list of vetted childcare resources for infants. Dorian cut in and said they did not want strangers, they wanted family. He said it with that loaded tone, like strangers are dangerous and family is owed, and Noemi asked why family support meant their adult daughter taking over instead of smaller supportive pieces, and Dorian said because Sable is capable, and he said it like my capability was a tool they could claim. Noemi asked them if they had considered a hired night nanny, and Maris immediately said they could not afford it, and I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because they were the ones who brag about their investments, they go on weekend trips, they buy expensive hobby equipment, but suddenly they cannot afford childcare, which told me they could afford it, they just did not want to spend their money on it when they could spend my life instead. Noemi suggested a sliding scale respite program, and Maris said she did not want people judging her. Then Maris turned and looked at me and said she did not understand why I was being so cold, and that word cold made my throat tighten, because refusing to adopt your sibling is not cold, it is normal. Noemi asked a direct question that seemed to surprise them. She asked if they were asking me to take temporary custody or permanent, and Dorian hesitated, then said, temporary, just until they got through the hardest part, and Noemi asked what timeline they had in mind, and Maris finally said, maybe a year, maybe 2, until he is more independent. A year or 2, that is not temporary help, that is them outsourcing the entire baby phase, and the room went quiet in that heavy way, and Noemi's expression changed slightly, like she was shifting from resource mode to concern mode. Noemi said if they truly felt unable to care for their infant for that long, they needed to discuss formal options, because asking an adult child to take over that level of care without legal planning puts everyone at risk, especially the baby, and Dorian snapped back that they did not want adoption, they did not want foster care, they wanted their daughter to be loyal. Maris then dropped the real bomb, not in one dramatic sentence, but in a messy spill. She said they had assumed I would move back home and finish my program from there. She said they had already told people I was coming home to help. She said they had already rearranged a room for me and Kellen, and she said it like it was a loving plan. I told her I was not moving back home, and Dorian's face went hard, and he told Noemi this meeting was pointless because I was being stubborn, and he stood up like he was leaving. Noemi asked them to sit back down, and Dorian refused, and Maris stood too, still holding the baby, and she told me if I was not willing to raise him then I had no right to be part of their family anymore, and she said it with this icy certainty that made my skin prickle, because that was the real deal, I obey or I am out. I told her that if she cuts me out, that is her choice, but I was not becoming Kellen's parent, and Dorian walked out first, Maris followed, still crying, and Noemi sat down slowly like she was processing what she just watched. Noemi asked me if I felt my parents might abandon the baby with me, and I told her they already tried once at my campus, and Noemi nodded and told me if they attempted again, I should contact the appropriate authorities immediately, because an infant cannot be used as a bargaining chip, and she told me she was going to document the meeting for her organization because it showed a concerning level of planning to transfer caregiving responsibility. I left that library room shaking, because even with a neutral person there, my parents still tried to bulldoze me, and now I knew they were willing to cut me off completely and also smear me to anyone who would listen. 2 days later, they followed through on another financial punch. My health insurance access portal showed my dependent coverage was terminated, because I had been on their plan under a family policy, and the termination effective date was immediate, and I stared at the screen feeling dizzy, because that is not just inconvenience, that is a safety risk, especially when you are in a hands-on program where injuries and exposure happen. I called the insurer, they confirmed the policyholder removed me, and I sat there with my phone pressed to my ear hearing a stranger politely explain that my parents had removed me from healthcare like they were deleting a contact. I had to go through my program to access a student plan, which is a whole process, and it meant more paperwork, more fees, and more time, but I did it because I had to. Then came the scariest escalation, the one that made me realize they might actually abandon Kellen somewhere. I was at work during a shift change, in a big distribution building where you have to badge in and out through a security turnstile, and the front desk called for me, which is rare, and when I walked up, the receptionist looked tense and told me my parents were in the lobby asking for me, and my whole body went cold. I asked if they had the baby, she said yes, and she said they were insisting it was urgent, and I told her not to let them pass the lobby, and I asked security to stand nearby, and the security guard came over and looked bored but attentive, like he has seen every kind of family drama and does not want it in the building. I walked into the lobby and saw Maris holding Callan's carrier, Dorian beside her with a bag, and the bag looked like a diaper bag, and my heart started pounding because it looked like a handoff. Maris started talking fast, telling me she needed to go to an appointment, telling me Dorian needed rest, telling me it was just for a few hours, and she was already shifting the carrier forward like she was about to place it at my feet, and Dorian was looking at the security guard like he was annoyed they were being watched. I told them no, I cannot take him at work, I cannot take him anywhere, and Maris's face crumpled into anger. She told me I was heartless, she told me any normal daughter would help, and I told her any normal parent would not show up at their adult child's workplace trying to hand off a newborn. Dorian stepped forward and said if I did not take Callan, they would have no choice but to leave him somewhere safe, and the security guard's posture changed instantly, like the word leave him flipped a switch. The security guard asked if there was a custody issue, and I said yes, they are trying to abandon their infant with me, and Maris gasped like I had accused her of a crime, and Dorian started saying I was exaggerating, and the guard asked them to leave the premises and told them if they did not leave, he would call law enforcement because an infant was involved and this was escalating. Maris looked around like she wanted an audience, like she wanted someone to tell her she was right, but everyone in the lobby was pretending not to see, and Dorian grabbed Maris's elbow and pulled her toward the exit, and they left still holding Callan, which was the only good part of that moment. The baby did not get put down. After they left, I went into a small break room and sat with my head down, trying not to shake, and Pax came in and asked if I needed him to document what happened for workplace safety, and I said yes, because if my parents were now showing up at my job with a newborn, I needed a record that this was real. So now I had a workplace incident record, a clinic note, a nonprofit facilitator note, and a campus security note, and I never wanted my life to have a paper trail like that, but it was happening anyway. That night I got a call from a number I did not recognize, and it was a child welfare intake worker. She told me a report had been made expressing concern that Maris and Dorian were attempting to transfer caregiving responsibility for their newborn to an adult child who did not consent, and that they had made statements about leaving the baby somewhere safe if the adult child did not comply. My stomach dropped, because I knew exactly where that came from, either Noemi or the clinic, maybe both, and I told the intake worker I did not report it, but it happened, and I confirmed the incidents, and she asked if I felt Callan was in immediate danger, and I said I did not think they would harm him, but I did think they might abandon him with someone else or try to force a handoff, because they were acting desperate and entitled. She told me they would be contacting Maris and Dorian for an assessment, and she told me if they attempted to leave Callan with me again, I should call emergency services, not because I want them arrested, but because an infant being abandoned requires immediate response. I ended that call and sat on my floor staring at my hands, feeling like I was watching my family split in half, because my parents could have just accepted help, they could have hired support, they could have adjusted their lifestyle, but instead they chose coercion, and now they were going to be on an agency radar. Final update 3 months later. My parents did not calm down after child welfare got involved, they got more controlled, which is almost scarier, because instead of wild public scenes, they started trying to maneuver through systems like they could outsmart the consequences. The first thing that happened after the intake call was Maris suddenly acting sweet again, not directly to me, because I did not answer her calls anymore, but through other people. She started sending messages through my aunt, through an old neighbor, through anyone who would pick up. And the message was always the same, they were just tired, they were just scared, they did not mean it like that, they just needed support. My aunt tried to broker peace, she asked me to come to a family gathering at a community arts center where they were hosting a small holiday craft fair, not a restaurant, not a park, just a big hall with tables, and she said it could be a neutral place to talk. I told her no, because I had learned the hard way that neutral places are only neutral if the other person respects neutrality, and my parents treat any setting as a stage if it gives them leverage. Instead, I agreed to one thing only, I agreed to a formal meeting if it was scheduled through the child welfare caseworker, in an office where everything was documented, with a clear agenda about Callan's care plan, not about me becoming the plan. The caseworker assigned was named Brooks, and Brooks called me to introduce himself. He sounded exhausted but direct. He told me he met with Maris and Dorian. He told me they denied wanting to abandon the baby, but they admitted they expected me to take over weekday care for an extended period, and he said they framed it as a family solution, not neglect. Brooks told me something that made my chest tighten. He said Maris and Dorian also claimed I had verbally agreed to help raise Callan during pregnancy, and that I was now backing out. And I felt this hot rush of anger because they were rewriting reality again, and this time they were doing it in an official context. I told Brooks I never agreed to raise their baby. I told him I offered normal supportive visits, and that they escalated to financial coercion and public ambushes when I said no, and Brooks asked if I had documentation, and I told him yes, and I asked where to send it, and he told me to bring it to the meeting so it could be placed in the file properly. The meeting was scheduled at the County Family Services Building, not a courthouse, not a therapy office, just a government office with a waiting room, and I went with Pax, which might sound odd, but Pax came as my workplace advocate because my parents showed up at my job, and Pax was the one who documented it, and he also knows how to stay calm when someone tries to steamroll a conversation. Maris and Dorian showed up with Kellen, and Maris looked tired, real tired, like the shine was wearing off, but Dorian still had that stiff posture like he could win if he sounded confident enough. Brooks greeted everyone and explained the purpose, which was to ensure Kellen's needs were being met and to clarify that I was not a custodial plan unless I chose to be. Brooks asked Maris and Dorian what support they had in place, and Maris started listing vague things like friends and community and faith, without naming any concrete childcare arrangement, and Brooks pressed for specifics: night coverage, daytime coverage, medical follow-ups, and Dorian got defensive, saying they did not need to justify their parenting to strangers. Brooks stayed calm and told him this was not a punishment, it was a response to multiple incidents where they attempted to transfer the baby to someone who did not consent, including statements about leaving the baby somewhere safe, and Dorian tried to argue that he never meant literally leave, he meant they would have to make hard choices. Brooks then turned to me and asked what I was willing to do, and I repeated the same thing: I will be a sister, not a parent, I will not provide childcare that replaces them, I will not be an emergency pickup, and I will not accept any legal responsibility for Kellen. Maris started crying again, but it looked different this time, less performative, more like she was finally realizing that crying does not change facts, and she asked what she was supposed to do, and Brooks calmly offered actual options: respite services, in-home support, vetted infant care, and he told them the county could connect them to resources if they were willing to cooperate. Then Dorian made the move that I think they had planned. He slid a folder across the table toward me, like it was a gift, and he said they had already drafted paperwork so everything would be easier. He said it was temporary guardianship for me, just until Kellen was older. Brooks immediately asked to see the folder, and Dorian hesitated like he did not want the caseworker touching it, but Brooks insisted, and Dorian handed it over. Brooks flipped through it, and his expression changed, and he told Dorian this was not temporary guardianship paperwork for a weekend, it was a petition draft for a longer-term guardianship arrangement, and it included language that would have made me responsible for medical decisions and schooling, and Dorian tried to talk over him, saying it was just a formality, and Brooks stopped him and said, very clearly, that presenting this to me in a meeting was not appropriate and it looked like an attempt to pressure me into taking legal responsibility. Maris looked shocked, like Dorian had not told her the details, and I watched her turn her head slowly toward Dorian, and for a second I saw a crack between them, like she realized he had been controlling the plan and selling it to her as something softer. Brooks told them he was adding the folder to the file as evidence of attempted coercion, and Dorian's face went red. He said Brooks had no right, and Brooks said he did, because it was introduced in a case meeting and it related directly to the report concerns. Dorian stood up, chair scraping, and he started saying he was done with this, that the county was overreaching, that families handle things privately, and Brooks stayed seated and told him that if he refused to cooperate, the county would consider next steps, because Kellen needed a stable caregiving plan that did not rely on pressuring an unwilling adult child. Maris did something I did not expect. She told Dorian to sit down, quietly but firmly, and Dorian froze like he had never heard her push back before. Then he sat, stiff, but he sat. The meeting ended with a written safety plan, not a dramatic court order, but a documented agreement that Maris and Dorian would not attempt to leave Kellen with me, would not show up at my campus or workplace, and would not list me as emergency contact, and Brooks scheduled follow-up visits to ensure they were actually using the resources offered. After that meeting, the financial cutoff stayed. They never turned my phone back on, never reinstated my insurance, never paid another tuition dollar, which was painful but also clarifying, because it proved the money was never about helping me succeed, it was about keeping me close enough to command. I finished my credential program anyway, not with ease, but with a combination of the emergency grant, extra work, and a small scholarship Halima helped me apply for that I would not have even known existed, and the night I passed my final practical assessment, I sat in my car outside the training facility and just stared at the steering wheel, because the stress finally had room to land. I did not tell my parents, I did not invite them, I did not send updates, because I was done treating them like people who deserved access to my milestones while they tried to turn me into unpaid childcare. As for Kellen, this is the part that ended everything for good. About 6 weeks after the safety plan meeting, Brooks called me and asked if I could come in for a brief file update. He said it was not an emergency, but he wanted me present because a change was being considered, and my stomach dropped because when an agency says a change is being considered, it usually means something is going sideways. I met Brooks in the same county building, and he told me Maris and Dorian had been offered in-home support, but they kept canceling visits. They refused respite because they said strangers would judge them, and they were still insisting family should take over. And Brooks said that during a recent home visit, Dorian stated they were considering relinquishing custody if the county would place Kellen with a family member. Brooks asked if I would consider kinship placement, and I felt like someone poured ice water down my spine, because hearing it framed that way made it real, not just a threat. They were actually willing to give up their baby to force me to take him. I told Brooks no, and I said it clearly, not because I do not care about Kellen, but because I will not accept a coerced placement that destroys my life and rewards their behavior. And Brooks nodded like he expected that, and he told me he asked because he had to, and he respected the clarity. Brooks then told me Maris and Dorian were being given a final window to engage with support services, and if they chose to relinquish instead, the county would coordinate a safe legal surrender process rather than letting it become abandonment. And hearing that made me feel sick, because it meant my parents had moved from coercion to an actual willingness to lose their baby just to win control over me. 2 weeks later, my aunt called me crying, telling me Maris and Dorian had surrendered Kellen through an arranged placement pathway, not dumped somewhere, not abandoned at a building, but formally handed over custody. And my aunt kept saying she did not understand. She kept saying Maris loved that baby, and I believed that in a twisted way. Maris loved the idea of the baby, but she loved control more. Brooks later confirmed Kellen was placed with a licensed infant foster family while the county reviewed permanent options, and because Maris and Dorian voluntarily relinquished, the process moved faster toward adoption planning. And Brooks told me the county was prioritizing stability and minimizing moves, and he told me my role was closed unless I chose to re-engage, which I did not. The last contact I had from my parents was not a heartfelt apology, it was a message delivered through my aunt, because they still did not respect boundaries enough to communicate appropriately, and the message was Maris saying she hopes I am happy, and Dorian saying I took their family away. I did not respond, because there was nothing to say that would not feed the version of reality they prefer, the version where they are victims of their daughter's selfishness instead of adults who created a child and then tried to hand him off like an unwanted task. The final thing I did was go back to the pediatric clinic and make sure my name was removed permanently from any contact list. Then I signed a form at my workplace security desk stating my parents were not authorized visitors, and the guard on duty recognized my name from the earlier incident and nodded like it was routine, like he had seen this before, and that made me feel both comforted and sad. I have not seen Kellen since the early weeks when I still thought this could be handled with normal family boundaries, and I have not spoken to Maris and Dorian since the day they tried to hand me a guardianship folder across a county office table, and when I got my new job offer call a month later, I accepted it quietly in my kitchen and turned my phone face down, because there was nobody left to call to share it with.